Good afternoon, everyone, or morning for some folks. Thank you all for being here. My name is Emile Rudisell. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a project coordinator with Forge. I'm excited to be here with you today. Your cameras and microphones are off and muted for the webinar, but please use the chat to talk with us. You can also use the Q&A section, anything like that to stay in touch, but no worries about your cameras. I saw that question in the chat. Today, we're going to be talking about weathering the storm, looking at the intersection of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, trans and non-binary communities, and disasters, with a special focus on safety planning with trans and non-binary survivors. I need to drink more water before we get started. All right. If anyone has trouble with my audio, just let us know in the chat. Sometimes it goes in and out. We also have ASL and captioning available. So again, thank you for being here. While you're here today, please take care of yourself in whatever way that looks like for you, taking breaks. This webinar is going to be recorded and we'll share that recording with you afterwards. So if you need to step away, that's fine. You'll be able to catch back up later on to anything. I love participation. I want to hear from y'all throughout in the chat, and there's no pressure. Participate in the ways that work for you. That might be listening and absorbing information. That might be sharing a bunch in the chat, taking notes, whatever it is. And we can share the PowerPoint slides with you afterwards too. So if you're someone who gets distracted by taking notes, the information will be available. So as just a quick update, who is Forge? If you haven't been with us before, we are a national trans-led organization who does anti-violence work. Forge is 29 years old and started doing a lot of direct services with trans and non-binary survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And we've expanded now to be national in scope and to do a lot of our work doing training and technical assistance for other service providers to help them support trans and non-binary survivors of all different kinds of violence. So in addition to domestic and sexual violence, hate violence, assault, harassment, things like that. And on this map, we are scattered around the country. Forge started in Milwaukee and is headquartered there. I'm in Florida, so you'll see as we talk about disasters, hurricanes are kind of my area of expertise, but I tried to wrap in other types of disasters. And we have staff on both coasts, as well as in Milwaukee. Forge's guiding principles are to be trauma-informed, empowerment-based, and culturally responsive. And all of these things really overlap with one another. It's hard to be one of those without being all three of them. So just in terms of being trauma-informed, throughout this webinar, I will be talking about disasters and also about people's experiences with power and control, intimate partner violence, safety planning. Try not to get into too many stories of specific types of violence, but I am going to be sharing some about tactics of control. And there are a couple videos that may have some imagery around different types of disasters that could be hard for people to see. I'll give you a heads up before the videos. And we also know that disasters, intimate partner violence, and systems of oppression and control can all cause trauma. So we're taking that into consideration throughout the training. And we want this to be empowering for you all. We want survivors to be supported through empowerment-based services and community. And all of that is attuned to all of our different unique cultures. So that's a little bit about us and Forge. I'm joined by my colleagues here today who are going to be doing tech support in the background. Caleb is here. We'll be dropping links in the chat for references. And Michael and Laurie are also joining us. They'll be in the background, but if you have tech questions, share in the chat. And we'd like to have you all introduce yourselves in the chat if you feel comfortable. You can share names, where you're from, anything like that, and a favorite part of nature. So as an example, again, I'm Emil, use they, them pronouns, and I'm in Florida. And I mean, I love anything that's like weird and possibly kind of ugly about nature, like deep sea creatures, and just all the like creepy reptiles and really large animals that Florida has. So that's mine. And I invite you all to share yours in the chat. Awesome. Stars and space totally count as nature. That's like my other favorite part about nature, the ocean and space. Great. Mycelium networks, how mushrooms care for each other, of it. Water, waterfalls, clouds. This is beautiful. Great. And keep sharing those, and feel free to check out each other's in the chat. Part of what I want to ground us in as we start talking about disasters and the intersection with our lives is that, you know, humans have been impacting our climate around us. And so though I use the phrase natural disasters throughout this a lot, some of them are not so natural. A lot of what we're talking about will also be true for human created disasters like oil spills, as well as human exacerbated disasters, which is what we're seeing with a lot of storms and weather related things, that they're getting worse and stronger due to climate change. So we're going to watch a short video that is about Florida and climate change to kind of ground us in a lot of the different things that are going on right now.
Everything will change. Everything that we know right now wasn't here before. It has changed, and it will continue to change because that's what nature does. As much as they want to create laws that try to keep things how they are to benefit who's in power, the reality is like everything changes. The changes that are being done right now will just eliminate us completely, everybody, not just those who they're trying to target. Us as humans, we have to make sure that we're making changes that allows us to continue to grow and thrive. The tiniest shift will cause a ripple.
And feel free to share any reactions in the chat. Caleb shared the link. This is a promo for a longer video. And I wanted to start with that to ground us in the fact that trans people have been a part of movements and work for climate justice and to support the earth and the land we live on as long as there have been people. And that continues to exist. But sometimes in mainstream conversations, these trans issues and climate change and violence are all considered separate, and they really are connected. And what we can do about them is connected. So that's our starting place. And here's an image to show this overlap in this connection. What we'll be talking about today is really at the center of these three diagrams. So intimate partner violence, anti-trans violence, and disasters. There's been some work where just two of those overlap, but there's not a lot of resources and support out there for that middle space where all three of these things come together. And to look at what does that look like, and then take apart the goals a little bit more. So for talking about intimate partner violence and trans people and trans communities, and there's a link in the chat to this power and control handout, which talks about some of the specific tactics that may be used against trans survivors or victims of intimate partner violence, and also by trans folks when they are being abusive. So please check that out to learn more, get into more detail. We know that trans and non-binary people experience intimate partner violence and sexual violence at higher rates than non-trans communities and people do. And that there are some specific tactics that are used, especially against trans survivors, targeting people's gender, controlling how people express themselves, using systems of oppression, using anti-trans attitudes and biases against the victim or survivor as a way to control them. All can happen. And we also know that sadly, there are fewer supports and resources available to trans communities. Many of the intimate partner violence and domestic violence resources that exist still have a lot of work to do to really be trans affirming and inclusive. And we also know that there's an intersection between disasters and violence. And at the end, we have some links on some of the research here. It does focus primarily on violence against women, but because we know that trans communities are already experiencing higher rates of violence, and we know that researchers don't always look at trans communities, we also know that this intersection is impacting trans communities a lot. So part of this, what happens in disasters, is that there's an increase in violence. This includes intimate partner violence, domestic violence, dating violence, as well as sexual assault and sexual violence that maybe isn't perpetrated by a partner. Some of this happens because abusers have increased access to victims during disasters where people are stuck at home, out of work, things like that. They're around each other more. Abusers will use disaster-specific power and control tactics. We'll look at some of those throughout the training too, but using the disaster as a way to control somebody, controlling preparation, response, and safety during the disaster, as well as using the disaster to justify the abusive person's actions, saying they were stressed out or overwhelmed as an excuse, even though there's no excuse for that violence. And we know that communities are more vulnerable at home and in disaster shelters. So disaster shelters create excellent safety during a disaster from the disaster, but don't necessarily create good safety for survivors of intimate partner violence, for trans communities, and for other vulnerable or marginalized folks. So this violence is increasing during disasters, and at the same time, resources are decreasing. Right? We have less access to safety resources. There are fewer. A lot of places close, and it's harder to get to the ones that stay open. Transportation can be affected. We see a road closed ahead sign, and routes can be changed depending on the type of disaster we're looking at. And survivors and anti-violence organizations are really part of disaster preparedness efforts. So when there are, government or community responses to disasters, they're not always thinking about the whole community. So they're not including, what about people who are experiencing intimate partner violence or coercive control? What about people who are trans? What about people with disabilities? Sometimes those are really left out. So resources decrease during disasters. And all of this is going to be true for a lot of different types of disasters, but does, of course, vary. Hurricanes, there's a long preparation period, longer. The hurricane itself lasts a day, 2, 3 days, and then the aftermath can be weeks or months even, depending on the impact. Heat waves might be shorter. Other types of disasters are less predictable. So there's just a lot of nuance here in how this actually is. But the decrease in resources happens across the board. And then what do we see for trans communities in particular during disasters? Again, trans and non-binary people have often been excluded and left out of community disaster preparedness. There is a decrease in access to trans affirming resources as organizations close so that them and their staff can take care of disasters. Those resources aren't available. People might not have access to doctors, medication, clothing, the things that they need for trans affirming support. And a lot of emergency resources are not culturally competent in trans communities, and people have experienced and reported increased scrutiny, harassment, and even violence when accessing emergency resources. That includes first responders and emergency shelter or cooling stations or things like that. So that's a lot that we're looking at of these overlaps. And so we want to really take into consideration, what can we do about it? But first I want to look at one thing that's a little bit unique is extreme temperatures and power outages. And this can happen during any type of disaster, but it's its own slide because we know that there are unique ways that heat waves especially can impact trans and non-binary people. And much of the United States is facing heat waves right now and in the past couple of weeks, and probably will be for a while. So one thing to consider there is physical safety. A lot of trans and non-binary folks use layered clothing to feel safer in public, either to affirm their gender or to present in a way that feels safer to them. That might include binding or just wearing a lot of different layers, scarves, things like that. That really sucks to do in the heat. So there are resources out there for tips on safe binder wearing during heat waves, things like that. Safety around cooling stations, which are often at religious institutions or libraries or things like that, considering how you could feel safe and dress and be safe there. And then with power outages make heat waves worse, right? A lot of people, especially with certain health conditions or disabilities, being without air conditioning in high heat can be deadly. And we know that trans communities often have fewer resources. Trans folks overall get paid worse, have worse housing, things like that, which leads to a decreased likelihood that we're going to have good AC or good insulation in our homes, which makes losing electricity and heat waves or extreme cold in the case of blizzards or things like that have an even greater impact. So let's take that and start to look at safety planning. And throughout, the next bit, we'll look at, what are things that survivors might be thinking about and considering, whether folks here, if you're coming here to plan for yourself or to help a friend or loved one to plan, please, add in tools, ideas, and take these and make them applicable to your lives. And for folks who are advocates or work at organizations, these are conversations. Throughout safety planning, everyone knows their own situation best and needs to think about what works for me at this time in this situation. And it's going to vary a lot. And I also just want to acknowledge that it's unjust that people experiencing violence have this burden of having to do this extra planning for safety. In a just and fair world, people wouldn't experience violence, and people who committed violence would be held accountable for their actions. There would be way more support. So it can sometimes feel really hard to talk through safety planning because folks are already dealing with a lot, and this is just like one more thing to deal with. And we can acknowledge the unfairness of that and hold on to that while also thinking about what are actions that we can take? What are things we want to do to help keep us safer, help keep our communities safer, and take care of each other? If you're not familiar with like intimate partner violence safety planning, a lot of people have heard of planning ahead for disasters. Maybe it was fire drills at school or in your house. We also do safety planning or emergency preparedness around natural disasters. And planning ahead can help with a lot of things, right? It can decrease those moments of panic or anxiety. It can make it so it's easier to make decisions, or so you don't even have to make decisions in a moment of crisis because you already decided, here's where I'm going to go, here's what I'm going to do. It can help keep folks connected, whether it's a family or a community. How are we going to stay in touch with each other? We have that already decided. And ensure supplies are available. I know in Florida, in the week before a storm, there's not water to be found at the grocery store anymore. The supplies are really limited. So if we plan much further in advance, we're better able to get those supplies and maybe even get them at better prices that we need. So I want to hear from y'all in the chat. Those are some of the benefits of safety planning, but what are some of the other things that make emergency preparedness for trans and non-binary survivors hard? What are some of the barriers or challenges in place for trans and non-binary survivors when thinking about planning for disasters? Right. In the chat, we've got can't afford to buy supplies for a plan. Absolutely. Many survivors feel that we're in a constant state of going through disasters. It's hard to prepare above that. Having to shelter with individuals who are unaffirming. Going to shelter may not feel safe. Yeah, absolutely. So losing access to medication. So barriers include, not being able to access the resources we need due to maybe lack of money. They're not affordable. There's no place to store them, keep things safe, either just for lack of having maybe stable housing or space in your housing, or because of the abuse from the abusive person who they're controlling the resources, controlling the finances. Lack of resources. I'm hearing this a lot in the chat, that emergency shelters and domestic violence shelters are not always inclusive to trans folks. When they are, you may still face harassment or challenges there. Money to buy supplies. And it might not be safe to disclose any of your identities, both being trans or non-binary and being a survivor, all of that. Not having safe spaces to learn acquired skills. Yeah, a lot of emergency preparedness might be doing stuff around your house. Are you both physically able, and do you know what it is that needs to happen? So you can keep challenges coming if you're still typing them, but think about, with those challenges in mind, what are some of the ways that we can address these barriers? And that might be for ourselves, for folks who are survivors, or thinking from the lens of a survivor, as community members and loved ones, and then as organizations or professionals. How do we challenge those barriers? And I'll share one thing that I've been thinking about with this for both the finances of how can I afford to buy these supplies, and knowing that supplies are often not available ahead of time, and how much economic abuse there is of survivors, is planning way far in advance. So when there's like a buy one get one deal on gallons of water, stocking up at those times before a storm is even on the horizon, or before a disaster is looming. Finding places to keep things in safer places. Great. In the chat, we have trying to create a plan with my roommates and any orgs I'm involved in. So talking to community members, roommates, friends, family, loved ones ahead of time. to develop that plan. And sometimes that can be a good source of social support too, and might address several barriers, including the logistics, but also the emotional barriers of this is really overwhelming. If we each as a community member do a small thing, that can be a big help. Get emergency contacts in order. Absolutely. And plus, Florida is going to become a lot more challenging with the anti-trans bathroom laws. Absolutely. So for me, one thing that we can do addressing these barriers is, as individuals, knowing our rights, getting familiar with what the law applies to and doesn't apply to. And then as community members and organizations, as really being prepared for that and finding ways to make sure that there are single stall bathrooms, make sure that there's access in the places we need to have it. Other things can include, brainstorming, working together, assisting with logistics. Friends and family may be able to help store things, may be able to just talk through things, have cars, share skills with each other. And organizations can really work to be trans affirming, do outreach to trans communities, keep extra supplies on hand and help survivors get supplies when they need them, which Brittany shared in the chat, helping provide coolers and fridge space for medication, food, and water. Great. And providing space for each other. Excellent. Thank you all. Yeah, and reach out to resources ahead of time. These are great. We can share all the suggestions in the chat too with y'all after this. So please keep those coming throughout. These are really useful. Yeah, and Katrina asks, are there any national trans rights legal aid organizations that might be called upon for violation of rights under emergency conditions? Yes, there are a number of federal guidelines protect rights during emergencies, and in looking at it, HHS and FEMA both have like non-discrimination statements and policies. So in really doing intensive work looking at some of those federal policies and going through their process might be helpful, as well as the trans-specific legal aid organizations. Okay. So again, focusing in more specifically before a disaster, some of the things that we're looking at are how abusers may try to control someone. And when a disaster is coming, we're planning for it, what we've seen is that abusive partners will do things like try to control how we make the home safer. That could include refusing to cover windows, refusing to buy supplies, or not controlling the finances in such a way that you can't get appropriate supplies. Eating all of the food ahead of time. Also controlling communication. So breaking a survivor's cell phone, denying access to internet, isolating a survivor so that they don't have some of the support systems y'all have been talking about, and controlling access to information. So, we have seen in Florida abusive partners lie about the storm that's coming and where it's headed, and deny a survivor the right and ability to access accurate information so that the survivor can make plans. So those are some of the things that survivors may have to be navigating and thinking about as they're building a safety plan. Other things are going to be specific to the type of disaster. What a lot of people do for most types of disaster is think about an emergency kit, your go bag or supplies to have in case of a disaster, in case of needing to get out of the home. So again, for more conversation in the chat, love to hear from everyone who feels comfortable sharing just one thing that you keep in an emergency kit, or that you think would be good to have one if you don't have an emergency kit. Great. We have EpiPen, heavy duty flashlight with working batteries, power banks, water, Narcan, alcohol and weed. Yeah, things to take care of yourself emotionally. And that's going to look different for every people. Tourniquet, first aid kit. Great. This a few days worth of my medication. And that the few days part is really critical for anytime you're thinking about emergency bags, is having several days of supplies. If you're working with a survivor, you are a survivor who's taking medications, figuring out, is there a way to get extra of it ahead of time? Can you get a refill before a storm hits so that you're sure to have enough? Things like that. The longer you can have extra for, the better. But we know with every medication, that's not always possible. Other tips that are really useful, especially if there's intimate partner violence in the home, is to make an emergency kit for everyone. In domestic violence, a lot of advocates talk to survivors about you having that emergency bag in case you have to get out. And that often includes identification, paperwork, medication, clothes, stuff for the kids. One challenge is that if an abusive partner finds that, they may increase their violence towards the survivor, towards the family, because they want to maintain control, right? And they don't want the survivor leaving. But if you prepare a hurricane bag or, a fire bag or something like that for every single person that lives in the home, it can be less suspicious. And often, depending on the situation, may have to be kept hidden. So that can be useful for survivors. What goes in it is definitely going to vary based on the type of disaster. You need different things for a blizzard than for a hurricane. And yeah, like we have mentioned in the chat, most advice says 3 days, but if you can plan for a week or more, do so. That can be really helpful. Power can be out for way longer than you expect. Staying informed also be a really critical part of an emergency plan, safety plan. So figuring out how to access local resources, especially about what safety facilities are open, where there are evacuation orders, and thinking about what feels safe for you to access can be really important. So again, this is the National Hurricane Center because I'm in Florida. And anytime there's a storm, I'm looking at this all the time. It may be safer for survivors to get alerts from a federal agency like the Hurricane Center or local weather alerts or things like that on their phone than it would be for them to, be looking up domestic violence resources. So thinking through in the particular dynamics of abuse, how can you access information safely? If it's not safe to access it at home, are there friends, family members, other people who can help the survivor stay informed of what's actually going on, knowing that sometimes the abuser tries to control information or give misinformation. And then think about safety around where you live. If it's in a house, an apartment, things like that, what are the options? How can you, if you're staying there or hoping to stay in the home through the disaster, how can you make it more safe? This will, again, depend on the weather conditions. Is it boarding up windows? Is it moving things away from the house to create fire breaks? Is it getting lots of blankets and warm stuff for blizzards? How do you get out of the home safely, especially in an emergency? And how can you evacuate the area? What are multiple different routes and what are your transportation options? And again, thinking about not just what if the storm or the weather affects my evacuation route, but what if an abusive partner slashes the tires on the car? Do we have alternatives to get where we need to go? So having multiple options can be really useful. And just thinking about that ahead of time can help you feel prepared if there is a crisis or an emergency and need to get. Communication is also really critical. Folks talked earlier about the emotional support and the help that friends and family can provide with logistics. So thinking about who do you want to stay in touch with and what ways are actually feasible to do that. Often we know abusers control communication or monitor communication. So is it possible to talk about, to figure out who to stay in touch with, to have code words, things like that. This will vary based on the abusive tactics, but have a backup plan. What if cell towers go out? What if the electricity is out for longer than your battery packs will last? What if the internet is down? A lot of people will post public information about their safety related to disasters. I know, there's like the Facebook safety check-ins that people can mark themselves safe after an event. Other people might say, on Instagram, don't worry, we're going to grandma's house. Those things can be really useful for folks to stay connected with each other and, to know where people are and how to get a hold of them. They can also potentially create some dangers if somebody is trying not to be found by other people, is dealing with stalking or harassment. That public information may either disclose where you are now or that your home is empty. So an abusive person may decide to break in or do other things to the home knowing that it's empty. So it's one thing to think about those plans ahead of time and maybe have alternative ways to stay in touch with people if it's not safe to do a wider, more public plan. So those are just a couple of the things ahead of disasters. As the disaster gets closer and closer, you're going to get more and more specific information. I'm seeing, look at local public transportation options in terms of evacuation, thinking about gun violence in particular. And Caleb has shared ready.gov has a kit for emergency kits. There's a lot of resources that are general to disasters, though not trans-specific for that kind of emergency preparedness. And folks can also work with domestic violence centers to talk about safety planning in terms of the abuse, though they are not always going to be super experts in terms of this specific intersection, but may help with general safety planning. Great. So now we're at during the disaster, which could be a couple hours, weeks, days, any amount of time. The abuse tactics that we've heard from survivors, increased physical violence, putting kids, pets, service animals, and the survivor at risk through, intentionally creating unsafe conditions, refusing to let somebody into a safer part of the home, forcing the family to go outside during a storm, all sorts of different things like that. Controlling access to supplies, hoarding or keeping all of the supplies for the abusive partner, or consuming them all ahead of time. And then blaming the victim, blaming the survivor, or blaming the disaster. So excusing the abuser's controlling and violent behavior by blaming other folks. And in the chat, we've got a disaster-specific power and control wheel that goes into some more specifics about tactics that we've seen used. This was created in Florida, just as a note, and Caleb mentioned this. It does use gendered language. The group that created it was really into using she for the survivor and he for the abuser, and we know that's not always the case. So there's helpful information, but it comes with that caveat that it's not worded the greatest. So during disasters, there's also decreased resources, right? Emergency responders are going to be available. When they are available, they don't always prioritize interpersonal violence over other types of things that are happening. Sometimes, especially when there's an evacuation order, they just won't come at all. There's lack of access to other supports. A lot of domestic violence shelters stop admitting people at a certain time. Courts close, other healthcare centers, all sorts of places are closed. And neighbors, friends, and other supporters may also not be available, or they can't get to you. So tons of decreased resources. And survivors are stuck in this balancing act of figuring out what's the danger from the disaster and what's the danger from the abusive person. So the disaster may be may be having you think about things like, where can I have backup power or electricity? What happens if our power goes out? What's the safest spot in the home? And with the abuse, we're thinking about, how do we keep ourselves and others safe? How do we maintain access to supplies, safety from weapons? Sometimes there's a contradiction, right? Sometimes the safest place in the home from the disaster is going to be like the bathroom or the basement or an innermost part of the house, but that's actually more dangerous from the abuse because there's no exit, or there's a lot of hard objects that an abusive person could push somebody against and cause serious injury. So there's not going to be one right good answer here. There's just a lot of trying to find the best balance that somebody can. And thinking through these things ahead of time with another person can be really, really helpful to survivors. You also want to think about other people's homes. So someone might stay in their own home, or you might go to somebody else's home, either in the same area, the same town, or out of town. So considerations there, and I know someone mentioned this in the chat, is, is the person you're staying with safe to disclose to? And what can they know? Do they know about the violence? Do they know about your gender? Are they closer to the survivor or to the abuser? And how is that going to impact your safety? Sometimes it might be safer to stay with other people because those are people the abuser will not be violent around. Sometimes it might be more dangerous because those are people that encourage or support the violent behavior. Are there ways to plan ahead for the physical space? Is it possible to do some of that same brainstorming and thinking about safe rooms, maintaining access to supplies, things like that, in a house you haven't been to before? And what do you need to bring with you? Again, those supplies, those emergency kits are really helpful here. How long will you be there? And what do you need to be affirmed in your gender and to be able to be yourself there? Is important to consider, as well as pets, kids, any other family members, things like that. Another place people might be during disasters is emergency disaster shelters. So again, trans folks experiencing violence are faced with multiple levels of complexity and barriers and challenges to safety. So for trans folks, bathroom and shower access, privacy in general, facing harassment from staff or other people staying there. There are, unfortunately, a lot of reports of violence happening at disaster shelters. Considering access to resources, especially trans affirming resources, are you able to bring enough of your medications? Are you able to bring clothes and grooming supplies that you need? Thinking about if there's limited bathroom access or limited water or electricity or things like that, what do you need to do in terms of grooming for folks who need to shave their face every day or other types of things like that? How can you be yourself and feel good in who you are and also feel safe there? Also, fear of outing from staff can be a concern. Emergency disaster shelters also aren't set up the same as domestic violence shelters. They don't have the same amounts of privacy, confidentiality, security measures, things like that. So it can be a real concern for survivors, whether they're staying at the shelter with the abuser or they're going to a shelter and don't want the abuser to find them or know that they're there. Disaster shelters are often not as confidential and they're more set up so that people can find each other versus domestic violence shelters that are set up to be confidential and private. So really thinking about what are the ways that you can stay safer there. And for everyone, some ways that may work depending on the shelter are identifying safe people. So, staff, volunteers, other people who are there who feel safer and being physically closer to them. If the staff feel affirming and supportive, trying to find like a bed or a place to hang out that's close to them. If they feel bad, trying to find a place that's further from them. Planning ahead to go with friends or another trusted person. Wearing a mask. Many of us are still masking for COVID precautions. In an emergency shelter, it's going to be crowded. People will have colds, all sorts of stuff. But a mask also can cover your face if that's something that is either, identifying from the abuser might make it a little bit harder to spot you, and may, hide facial hair, things like that, if that's a concern for somebody in terms of, their outness towards around gender. If staff feel safe to talk to them about your privacy concerns. You have privacy. Is there a private place to talk to them about the violence that's happening or your safety needs? Where can you stay that maybe is private but not isolated? Because isolation can be dangerous and vulnerable, but privacy can be really valuable. I'm talking to domestic violence or intimate partner violence programs in the area ahead of time to connect with their resources when it's available. Many survivors may choose to go to a domestic violence shelter rather than an emergency shelter if possible, for the additional safety and confidentiality, even if it's not the perfect solution. Another thing to consider is going to a further away shelter. What we've seen here is survivors who don't live with the abuser, don't want to be found by the abuser, will go to the shelter that's not closest to them because that's where the abuser expects to find them, and will go looking for them. So if you have options, if you have the resources and transportation, thinking about what might make it harder for you to be found or what might feel safer to you. We've also seen that a lot of survivors will use the disaster as an opportunity to leave a relationship. For those who are advocates or friends or family members of survivors, it should always be the survivor's choice if they want to leave and when they want to leave. Leaving can escalate danger a lot. So this isn't advice to leave, but for folks who want to leave and are using the disaster as that opportunity, sometimes that can be really helpful. And just think through, who do you want to tell? Are there people who need to know where you are? And are they going to be people that might tell the abuser on purpose or accident? Where are you going to go? What do you need to bring? And how are you going to get there? So all of those considerations. Some people will, I've talked to survivors who, have used as an opportunity to tell the abuser, I'm going to go stay with my mom until the hurricane passes. And they don't go stay with their mom. They go somewhere else. So the, abuser is like, okay, yeah, that's fine. Doesn't follow them, but then can't find them because they're not where they said they are. So there are options like that that can sometimes increase people's safety. After a disaster. Unfortunately, disasters don't end when the weather condition has passed, anything like that. So I want to look again at power and control tactics. We're seeing a lot of patterns here probably of abusers trying to control home safety measures, access to resources and supplies, communication, and access to information. Right? And what do those look like after disaster? For folks returning home, so either in shelter or out of town, thinking about their physical safety from the violence. If this is a situation where the person is trying to stay away from the abuser, does not want contact with them, some considerations might be, not going directly home from a disaster shelter. It's public when the shelter's closed, right? So that's when the abuser will expect somebody to return home. So waiting longer, taking different routes, things like that to be able to actually get home safety. Safety from the disaster and the aftermath. A lot of injuries and fatalities after disaster, from disasters, come afterwards, from power outages, from dangerous conditions, from floods. In Florida, a common thing we've seen is that people with injuries, those will get infected because the standing water is really toxic and has dangerous stuff in it. So being careful about things like that can be really important. And again, for folks with disabilities, folks who need electricity for medical equipment, for temperature control, for anything like that, power outages can be really dangerous. So consider, who can tell you if the power is still on. Electricity companies don't always have accurate information. Do you have a neighbor or friend who can check on the home? Also consider access to resources. Are you going to be able to have enough gas in your car to get food and water when your supplies run out? Do you need to get those from somewhere else? Or do you need to stay away because none of the stores are open yet? And medical supplies, how long will it be before you can get prescriptions filled again, before you can get to the doctor and get other needs met? Okay, I also see a lot of abuse related to recovery efforts in terms of financial abuse, that an abusive partner may try to steal recovery money, get, the FEMA Red Cross money put in their names, take the check, force a survivor to spend the money in ways the survivor doesn't want to or wouldn't otherwise. So thinking about safety planning in terms of that and economic abuse is really important. There are also going to be, trans-specific considerations here. Is the government recovery efforts going to require, your legal documentation using your legal name? And how does that feel? Is that safe? Are there people who can support you and go with you to help the process be more trans affirming, or at least have you have an ally there? Other resources that might exist are local mutual aid efforts, and trans resources and organizations will sometimes engage in that mutual aid and recovery efforts. So those can be places to look for support. And I'm going to pause to drink water and see if people have stuff to add in the chat here. All right. I also want to just briefly talk about our emotional well-being. This can often get neglected with so much else going on. I'm really resonating to what somebody said early on in the chat of like, it's just one more thing. There's like disaster after disaster after disaster. So it can be overwhelming. And we want to acknowledge that stress and trauma and take time to deal with those feelings in a way that works for you. So that might be taking a moment to name your feeling before moving on, just so that it's there, using coping mechanisms. So here on the side, I have connection, attention, and care. And those words stand out to me as really ways we take care of ourselves and each other, connecting with supportive people, paying attention and noticing our feelings, even if only for a moment, and then you need to distract yourself or use coping mechanisms or something else like that. And then care, really affirming care for yourself and care for others, even in those situations where, quote, nothing bad happened. We're often really stressed out before a disaster and during a disaster. And sometimes, it feels like I can't, that stress was a waste of time because nothing bad happened. But it's a normal part of our human experience, and affirming to ourselves and to each other that our preparation was worth it, that it's okay that you spent time being worried. You can both be glad you're safe and be exhausted from worry. Those two things can happen at the same time. And there are, Caleb put the Anti-Violence Project's hotline in the chat. They do a lot of queer and trans anti-violence work and domestic violence work. So that's a place of support for trans folks. SAMHSA has a disaster-specific helpline that people can access. And this, again, just names that it is okay and, a part of the human experience to have stress or trauma from disasters. So whether it's reaching out to SAMHSA, loved ones, other community-based supports, getting that, taking care of your emotional well-being after disasters is important. Okay, just looking through the chat. So I have one more video we're going to show, and this is kind of a synopsis from a longer video, Fire and Flood. We're just going to watch like half of it to talk about resilience and fear of climate change. It's a little bit hard to hear, so I apologize in advance, and there's not captioning. And the first image you're going to see is of fire and flames. If you don't want to see that, just close your eyes for 5 or 10 seconds. And then after that, it's a visual, but I think that's the only like fire image.
I was evacuated at 4 a.m. A lot of disaster relief is very religious based. Are these people that our community can trust?
I have a compromised lung capacity. I'm worried that the plan would be that we just die. I don't want that to be our plan.
We need to organize under the assumption that shit is going down in terms of climate, in terms of politics. So let's have a medical system that works at a grassroots level. Let's have a food system that works at a grassroots level. Let's have an energy system that works at a grassroots level, like at the hyper local, so that when the larger structures fall as we want them to, we have those already set up.
It's a hard time to be alive, and it's an amazing time to be alive.
What I understand and learn from between being queer and working the land is very much about how I can support in the colony of Puerto Rico polyculture.
Just historically, Two-Spirit were able to or asked to do certain things that benefited the tribe. To me, it's a term of ancient responsibilities.
Yeah, I've been a rich man, and I've been a poor man, and I choose love, na 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 na, choose it every time. I choose love, na 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 na, choose it every time. I choose love, I choose it every time.
There are driving forces that are forcing us into the current way, and we have to unveil them and be willing to step outside of them. And I think that if we lean on the people who've already been doing that by forceful nature, those people actually have really great solutions for us.
There's a historical experience of queer and trans folks, and what I know personally as a trans person is like, we exist in those in-between spaces, it's like, we're not scared of it, we're not afraid of it, like, come in, sit down, have a cup of tea, we'll come to our world. You know, like we've been sitting with knowing that how it's been isn't working. So what are we gonna do about it?
Just a little bit of love. Yeah. We need a lot more love. Yeah. Just a little bit of love.
I'd love to hear folks share in the chat anything that resonated with them in that video, or things that made you think of. I know that last speaker stands out to me. We know we've been sitting with knowing that how it's been isn't working. So what are we going to do about it? And I wanted to bring this in to highlight the ways, again, that trans communities have been involved in really thinking about how we make our communities safer for a long time. And so what we're doing is connecting that in to additional issues that we're facing our communities, of intimate partner violence, of disasters, climate justice, things like that. Thank you. Could we have in the chat, the idea of ancient responsibility to the community gave me goosebumps. Yeah, me too. Thank you. Also want to highlight, they mentioned just briefly, again, this is a short clip, the localness. So we need a local medical system, a local energy system, local food systems. And so thinking about just how we take care of each other in our own communities and can build up those resources and make sure those resources, as they're building up, include trans folks is really important. Many of us probably know that we can value our local community, and we might not have trans resources here right now. So what can we do to shift that? So our goal is, right, making the world safer for all of us. And that includes thinking about intimate partner violence. That includes thinking about the expansiveness of all of our genders and how we can be affirming and supportive and safe for that. And it means thinking about the climate and nature and the world we live in. And on a practical level, what we can do is make sure that we're talking about this intersection in our preparedness work. Whether it's, the county emergency operations center, or, your neighborhood or your family, talk about how trans and non-binary people, how trans and non-binary survivors are included in disaster preparedness. One specific step is making sure that, first responders and emergency relief staff are getting trained on these issues so that the places we go to for safety are actually safer. We should also all be included in the recovery efforts. There's a lot of research about what happens when communities are excluded from recovery efforts. I've heard one story of after a major disaster, people were planning to build temporary homes for all the families. And they built all these temporary homes. And then a bunch of people were like, where are the kitchens? And they hadn't included anybody who was responsible for taking care of families and preparing food in the planning efforts. So none of the planners thought about the fact that homes need kitchens. And that's like, it just feels comical how absurd that is, but it makes such a huge impact on lives, and really points out what happens when we leave communities out of our planning process. And also think about, climate resilience and infrastructure process, and how we can get connected to those. And those may be more, formal processes. They may be more like community gardens, informal networks, whatever it is. And this visual kind of highlights all of that. And to build resilient communities where we are taking care of each other, where we can thrive and get through disasters and recover from them, we need all of these different pieces of work, and we need them to overlap and feed and nurture each other. So that's climate justice organizations, trans people and organizations, anti-violence work, local infrastructure, mutual aid projects, and housing and resources for folks. So this is kind of the ecosystem we want to create where all of us can be safer. We're gonna share a bunch of resources kind of as we close, and we've got time for questions. So as I'm going through these, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat or additional comments, please share. So these are disaster preparation resources. These generally are not trans specific. Well, the first two are not trans specific. So if you're using those, we have to do the work ourselves of adding in, like, what do we need as trans folks? What do our trans community members need? We also have a blog post that we put together about coping with climate dread, which has some great emotional strategies. And then Lurie mentioned in the chat earlier, an guide from the National Center for Trans Equality on emergency preparedness. Organizations can also do a lot to prepare and help meet the needs of trans folks and survivors in disasters. So these are, again, a bunch of different links, meeting the needs of trans evacuees, what domestic violence organizations can do to prepare. There's a few different guides. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center has created a more comprehensive guide on sexual violence in disasters. It's got some reference to LGBTQ communities, but that's not the focus, but the information is still super useful. And then globally, there's also been a lot of work on how we can include gender equity and anti-violence work in our disaster response. And I do want to include a few kind of examples. I mentioned at the beginning that we know that violence increases during disasters. And here are just a couple articles about that. These do primarily focus on violence against women or use that sort of framework. So we need to read that through our lens of knowing how intimate partner violence affects trans communities. But if you want some of the more research, more specifics on what that looks like, these are examples. And then as we wrap up, I want to share Forge's resources. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube to see past trainings, and we'll be posting this once we finalize the recording. And you can also check out our website and our blog, transsurvivors.com. And I'm Emile again. Please email me questions, comments, additional information. We are working on putting together a written tool based on this content that'll go, even more in depth on some of the stuff that I briefly covered today. So keep an eye out for that in the future. But please reach out to us and talk to us about things. Thank you all so much for being here, for your participation, for the work that you do, for existing in this world. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you again for being here and for helping connect these issues and build and support our communities.